My name is Brad Fraser. I'm a writer and director, and spiritually I have to say I believe God lives in all people, but He lives in very few churches. I have never courted controversy. All I've tried to do is tell stories that reflect the society we live in honestly, and I try to tell them as provocatively and as entertainingly as I possibly can. The unfortunate truth is, I believe, that we live in a society where the most radical, outrageous thing a person can do is say what they really think and what they really feel. And I think if I've been painted as being outrageous, it's because I am outspoken and because I'm not afraid to say what I really think, and I think that is so alien to most people, particularly in the media, that they have no other way to look at it except as being controversial, but I don't think it's controversial at all. The things that I'm doing, the things that I'm writing about, and the things that I'm saying, and yes, it uses nudity, and yes, there's sex, and yes, there is violence, and yes, there is profanity, all that stuff I'm talking about exists, and if we don't talk about it, it's never going to change. It's never going to go away. If we don't know the reasons why we live in this dysfunctional world and maintain these dysfunctional relationships, it's never going to change. And the greatest sin to me is the sin of television, is the sin of trivializing and simplifying and making people appear to be much less complex and rich and interesting than they actually are. And my whole reason for being a writer is to say the pictures we're being shown of one another are incorrect. They're wrong. They're not accurate. They're not even close in a lot of situations. I want to try to tell the reality of what I see, and I want to do it honestly. My parents were very young when I was born. I mean, my mother had just turned 16. My father was just 17, and I don't think that's probably the best age to be raising children, even in the late 50s, early 60s, which, you know, was at that time. And we moved around a lot. We were very, my father basically was unable to keep a job. We lived in motels on the side of the highway and trailer courts and other people's houses and that kind of thing. It was a childhood. I mean, there was love in it, certainly from my mother and from people outside of the family. There was love, but there was a lot of conflict. There was a lot of violence within my family. There was a lot of alcohol abuse within my family. And I think when I was about 13, my parents divorced, and it was a huge relief because up to that point, I had never lived anywhere for more than a year in my life. I'd never lived in the same house for more than a year or the same town for more than a year. So it wasn't until adolescence that I started to find some stability in my home and in my family. And shortly before my parents divorced, my father became very violent, and he was beating me quite frequently. And I finally got tired of it. And I stood up to him and I said, I don't care if you kill me. I don't care how badly you hurt me. You cannot do this to me anymore. This is absolutely wrong. And I think any child who at 12 or 13 years old has to do that with their father. Everything after that is going to be easy. Everything after that is going to be simple. And I think that when you recognize the problems that one's parents have and that adults have, and you realize that those are rampant among all adults, and in fact they aren't much brighter and they don't know more than you do, that it's a tremendous freedom. And it was when I found that freedom, in fact it was that very thing that I think that spurred me to be who I am, that gave me the strength and the determination to write plays, even though I was working for theaters that were saying, we can't ever put this on, this will never happen, to go to towns like Cincinnati and say, you have to do my play, it's wrong for you not to do it. I mean, the strength and determination to do those things, I think, comes directly from this very bad relationship with my father. And I think that even then, when I was 13, 14 years old, that was still the case. There was no real religious education. I mean, we were aware, we were called Christian, although there was very little Christianity or Christian teachings going on in the household. And we were sent to Sunday school basically so my parents could have sex on Sunday mornings, which was their only interest in getting us out of the house. And that was about the full amount of my spiritual upbringing as a child. Learning to pray, I suppose, is the first religious experience that I had and that most children have, that if you have parents who have any kind of religion, you are taught to pray, you are taught to tap into a larger consciousness or idea of consciousness that exists beyond yourself and beyond the visible, tangible world that we live in. I suppose that was my first religious experience. And then after my parents divorced, we went through a period when I was about 14, 15, where we became attached to a Baptist church through friends, and we started going. And we started experiencing what I thought were religious experiences, which were these amazingly emotional calls to the altar and calls to God, which I actually gave myself to and surrendered my life to be a Baptist preacher at that time. And I remember being very, very emotionally moved by what was going on, by the music, by the words of the preacher, by the sense of what was going on in the people in the church. But I realize now that what I thought was a religious experience was actually a theatrical experience. And I suppose the reason that I've gone into the theater and the reason I became a playwright and became a director within the theater is because, in my mind, the line that separates the church from the theater is a very, very fine one. And when I became disillusioned with the Baptist church, and I decided I didn't want to be a priest and a preacher, and I decided that, or I discovered that I was homosexual, and as a homosexual, I wasn't welcome in the church anyway. I mean, the move to the theater for me was not a very big move from the church to the theater. What the church does and what the theater does, when they both work really well, is they provide you with an emotional experience, with something that is predominantly emotional, being shared among a large group of people while you're focused on something that's going on in front of you on a stage, whether that's a show or whether that's someone up there speaking about God, I don't know. But once the music comes into it, and once the singing comes into it, it seems to me that church is the original form of theater, and probably the purest form of theater that exists in our society, that people started gathering together out of a very profound need to share and explore things with one another. And I think what makes people go to church and what makes people go to the theater is exactly the same need. As I learned more about the church, as I spent more time with the people who worked in the church, as I got to know them better, I really discovered that what I had believed, which is this is a place for all people to come and it's a safe place for people and it's a place for people to worship, was in fact not true. There were a great many people who weren't welcome in that church, including people of color, including homosexuals or lesbians. Divorcees were frowned upon, although they were encouraged to come. And that, I think, with my awakening sense of who I was and what my sexuality was, worked to take me away from it. It worked to, it didn't seem fair to me. It didn't seem right. And the things that bothered me at school, the things that bothered me in the many little towns that we lived in, the kind of repression, the hatred and fear of people who are different and that kind of thing, I found it just as strong in the church as I did in those other places, and in the same way, I rejected it. I didn't feel that my sexuality had anything to do with my relationship with God or the church, but you know, we're talking about 1973, 1974 here. It was a very different time, and one couldn't even talk about being homosexual. One couldn't even talk about being gay, and one certainly couldn't go to their priest and talk about being gay, or to their pastor or to their preacher and talk about it, because all you were told was that it was wrong and you mustn't do it. And for an adolescent who's discovering their body, who's going through puberty, those are very hard things to be told. You're being driven by things that are much stronger than your brain. And ultimately I decided it was wrong. What they were teaching me was wrong. There was nothing wrong with who I was. I was who I was and who I always had been. But in fact, people's attitudes started to change toward me as I became more aware of my own sexuality and the fact that I wasn't like them in every way. After I left the church and I was no longer part of that community, I had maybe a year or two of kind of drifting around trying to figure out what it was I wanted to do. And also, you know, those were the years 16, 17, where one experiments with alcohol and one experiments with sex and drugs and all of that kind of thing. But I was lucky because when I was in high school, I developed this very strong interest in the theater, and I ended up going to a school for the performing arts. And the theater is a community as well, just like the church is, in fact, better than the church was, because in the theater I found people like me. I found people who thought like me. I found people who lived the life I wanted to lead, or gave me guidance toward a life that I wanted to know, and people who were very interested in art and self-expression. So really, I just moved from one community to another. I'm a 43-year-old gay man. I lived through a crisis that literally wiped out 90% of the people I knew and loved. I mean, the AIDS crisis and what it did to, what it did to the planet, but what it did to my community, what it did to my immediate circle of friends, what it did to my chosen family, left me in a place where I didn't find a lot of faith, where I didn't find a lot of happiness, and where really I felt like I was facing nothing but despair. And in 1996, one of my best friends, who I hadn't spoken to for some reason, he wouldn't be in contact, he wasn't in contact with me. I got a phone call from a hospital saying he's in the emergency ward, he's got the weekend to live. If you want to see him, you better come and see him now. And I ran down to the hospital immediately. I saw him. He was in very advanced, late stages of AIDS. He was in an isolation tank. You couldn't go in there. You couldn't touch him. You couldn't breathe the same air that he could. And I went home that night, and he was one in a line of a great many people. And I felt so completely powerless. And I felt so devoid of hope and of any kind of sense of going on, that I had to do something. And I couldn't go out and get drunk, and I couldn't go out and get high, and I couldn't go out and get laid. Those things were they weren't the solutions that I needed, and I really didn't know what to do. And I knelt at the side of my bed and I prayed like I've never prayed before in my life, but I prayed like I hadn't since I was a child. And I didn't pray for my friend to get better, because at that time people did not get better. What I prayed for was strength, was the ability to go on, to just accept what was happening, to try to make some changes in it, in myself, whatever was required, but that I couldn't go on anymore in this state. And in the course of that prayer, and this is not like a 10-minute prayer, please help me, please help my friends, this was very much an opening up of myself in a way that I hadn't opened up in a very long time. And the next day, I woke up and I felt clean. I didn't feel hopeless. I didn't feel powerless. I didn't feel like I had lost anything. In fact, I felt like I had gained something, and I didn't know what it was that I had gained, and I still can't articulate it. But what happened was, within 2 days, they had put my friend on brand new protease inhibitors, which were just starting at that time, the cocktail, and he got better. He literally, within 3 months, looked like someone who had never been sick at all. And he was a skeleton when I went to see him in the hospital. And something happened to me that night. When you talk about religious experiences, there was no one appeared to me in a ball of flame, and there were no heavenly angels, there was no vision. There was just a sense of, I've spoken to someone I haven't spoken to in a very long time, and that person answered back. And what I asked for, they gave me. And since then, prayer is one of the biggest tools of my arsenal for dealing with the world, for dealing with my career, for dealing with the crazy situations I have to go into. I feel now that every time that I pray, I strengthen myself. I open myself up to something bigger and better and stronger than I am. And for a very long time, I didn't believe there was anything bigger or better or stronger than me. And that experience brought me back to praying again. And now prayer is a habit for me. I pray regularly for my family, for my friends, for the people I love, for the state of this crazy world we live in, because I can't do anything about terrorists. I can't go and take action on these things. So what can I do? All I can do is send out what I hope is good energy, and if everybody else in the world is doing it as well, then maybe something will happen. Maybe we will promote some actual change on this crazy planet. My spirituality has always been a very private thing for me. My beliefs have always been a private thing for me, but I think one of the problems with the society we live in right now is that people don't discuss spirituality. People don't know what they think about God, and what they do think, they don't share with other people. There's some kind of shame attached. There's almost like a stigma attached to the fact that you may believe in God or you may follow the tenets of a particular religion. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think we all have a great deal to learn from one another, and from the things we believe and from the things we do, and mostly from the way we cope and the way we deal with the things life throws at us. I think that if we can share those things, and I do try much harder. I've been talking to my friends I've had for 20 years. that I had no idea what their religious beliefs are. Do you believe in God? Do you have any spirituality? And we've started to talk about these things, and I think in talking about them, we get to know one another better, but we also start to adopt each other's viewpoints, the things that seem to work, the kind of ideas that you might have that I hadn't heard or thought about before. I can adopt those and vice versa. And I think that's very important when we live in a society that becomes increasingly compartmentalized, where people get pushed into smaller and smaller groups and subgroups all the time, so that we have a religious channel and a black channel and a white channel and a gay channel. And I think that that's a really dangerous thing. I think we lose the sense of respect of people being different and having different ideas. And I think that if we can talk about spirituality, if we can talk about our beliefs with respect and not get upset and say, what I believe is better than you, or what I believe is more correct than what you believe, then I think we will make the world a much better place to live in. There was rampant sexual abuse throughout my entire family, which was being inflicted on children by a much older cousin that no one found out about. We all believed we were the only victims of what was going on. We never even shared it with one another as children. And there was also a lot of physical violence that went on between my father and me when I was a child, and went on throughout the entire family, mostly between the men. I mean, they were a very violent family, so there was a lot of that kind of thing. But what's important to me now, I don't really enjoy discussing this, and I don't think people really enjoy hearing it, because it's very private. They're very private family issues, and they're not things that the general public is really comfortable hearing about. But I think what's important is that there is this sense in our society that if you are mistreated as a child, that you will somehow grow up to be a damaged adult, or a more damaged adult, if you will, than most other adults, and you're going to end up jumping off the Bloor Street Viaduct or being a junkie and dying in an alley or something. And I think it's really important to children who are out there now who may be going through a similar experience or having the same thing happen to them, to know that, in fact, as an adult, you don't have to be defined by things that happened to you as a childhood. You can't ever change those things, and you can't do anything about them, but you can move on, you can get past them, and you can make something very, you can become someone very important. You can become someone very talented. You can become someone who's very happy. You aren't, destined for a life of horror and tragedy because you come from a disadvantaged background as a child. I certainly will admit I look at the world with a jaundiced eye. I mean, you don't come from the background I've come from, and you don't meet the kind of people I've encountered in my life, and particularly my early life, without developing a certain wariness about your fellow man. And my work certainly reflects that, but I also think all of the work, which can be very dark and can be very hopeless, always ends with the people coming out towards some pinpoint of light at the end. Toward, they've been through a horrible experience, and through that horrible experience, they've been changed, they've been altered, and in some ways they've been bettered. And I think that that's who I am. I don't lie to myself, and I don't look at the world with rose-colored glasses, but I also know that there is hope, and there's a hope for everybody, and that you should never give up hope on any particular person, because everybody has inside of them the capacity to grow, to heal, and to become someone else. And I have made overtures in the course of my adult life toward my father and toward the estranged members of my family. But just because I've changed doesn't necessarily mean they've changed, and I don't really care in that case. I mean, because I think once you extend an olive branch, once you extend the hand to someone a certain number of times, there comes a point where you just have to go, this isn't going to happen, and it's counterproductive for me to keep trying. So I suppose on some level, yes, I think, yeah, it would be great if my father could accept who I am and could accept the person I am and could look at all the things I've done in my life and go, I'm proud of you, but he's not that person, and I can't make him that person, and I don't even want to. I don't believe God is like a big white man sitting up in the clouds with a big white beard being really bitchy about everything people on earth are doing. A God who makes rules other than the kind of rules we need to live by to get along with one another, which is, treat another person with the same respect you want to be treated with. I mean, those are all very, very basic rules, but I do think in terms of finding strength within yourself or finding strength outside of yourself, finding energy, finding power, finding solace, finding faith, I think those things exist, and I think they exist on a plane that we can't understand, and through prayer and through opening ourselves up as spiritual beings, we get in touch with that kind of thing. Without getting too new age or kind of flaky about it, I believe that's what God is. Whether that energy is somehow the cumulative power of humanity creating something on its own, or whether it comes from another place, I don't know. But I do believe very much that it can be tapped into and it can be utilized. It can be utilized in a positive way. If God did have a physical being, I really hope God would be a very heavy black woman who's probably a lesbian. Because probably that would be the most interesting person for us to find out, the most interesting idea of what God is, that this idea of God being a big white man up somewhere taking care of everything doesn't appeal to me at all. I mean, I think God is a cherry blossom blooming on a tree in the middle of spring just as the snow is melting. I mean, I think God is a child walking down the street with his mother with that look of happiness on his face. I mean, I think we see God everywhere, and I think to try to give God a gender or a physical sense is a mistake, because then we start going, God is like us, or God is not like us. And the truth is, if there is a God, he's like everything and anything on this planet. I think when I write, I create characters. I create characters who are a combination of completely fanciful, fictional ideas and people who are composites of other people I know, people I met, people I see in the media, that kind of thing. And I think that the understanding of God, the connection to God really comes through a connection through other people, that we see God's work through the work of other people, through the way they react, through the many differences, through who they are, through the very complicated kind of interactions that go on between human beings. And I think that I don't think you can write about people without writing about God. I mean, my characters don't talk about their spiritual beliefs or their religious beliefs very much. In some of the plays they do, but generally not. But in my mind, they all have very specific beliefs. Some are true believers, some are non-believers, some have very unconventional beliefs. But I think that you can't begin to connect with a sense of God if you can't connect with other people. The greatest miracle of humanity is that we do manage to have relationships, we do manage to love each other, we do manage to hate each other, we do manage to live these lives that are filled with very rich emotions, and those emotions come because of interaction with one another, and I think that interaction with one another has to be there before we have any kind of interaction with God. Most of the protests about my work come from people who apparently have nothing to do besides make trouble. None of it comes from a particular church or a particular belief or religion or group of people. I mean, it comes from individuals who seem to be more than anything else scared of going into the theater and actually feeling something, as opposed to sitting there and being bored and falling asleep and going home at the end. I think that's what really scares them. But I do actually have to say probably the most outrageous thing I've ever done is giving this interview right now, because the Brad Fraser that exists in a great many people's minds doesn't talk like this and doesn't believe these things. And in talking about them, I've probably made myself more vulnerable than I ever have in an interview in this kind of a situation before. And people like to think that nudity is outrageous, violence is outrageous, sexuality is outrageous, but in the society we live in right now, the most outrageous thing is daring to be intimate. Daring to be intimate with other people, daring to be intimate with God, and to come on television and talk to you about these things that I feel and believe are, by my estimation, the most outrageous thing I've ever done.